I'm not going to forget to record this time. All right. Well, happy Monday, everybody. It is Monday, November 4th. This is the Solid Ground live stream. I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm joined, as usual, by Jennifer Friend. And today we have Dr. Dani Sulikowski on with us again and Dr. Dean Abbott again. So it's a pleasure to see the two of you, well, the three of you. It's a pleasure to see all of you. Jennifer's not chopped liver. It's good to see you too, Jennifer. And we are live on YouTube. I went live a minute early, so we'll just let people catch up. But for anybody interested in in these types of conversations, we started this live stream about 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, in order to promote our peer support and discussion group. And the discussions that we've had the opportunity to engage in here have been really enriching for me and really fun. This is one of the highlights of my week, these live streams. And another highlight of my week is our discussion groups. So those are private, not recorded. Those are just for our members, and we love them. If that is something that you'd be interested in doing, you're welcome to join us. I'll put links below to our Substack and our locals, and please do join us if you're interested. Dani, we had you on about, I guess it was like late September, we recorded that one. And it got so much response. It was just like, it's by far the most watched episode we've ever done. And, not the most watched thing I've ever put on my YouTube channel, but of our Solid Ground episodes, it was the most watched. It got a tremendous response. You are an evolutionary psychologist, and you talk about, and I'm not going to do it justice, so I'm just glossing a little bit, but I'll let you introduce your theories. But one of your theories is around how women contribute to societal decline. And it's very interesting. You get into a lot of detail about why you hold this opinion and what you base your theory on. And I felt like we scratched the surface last time. I know I say that a lot about a lot of topics because in an hour, that's about all you can do. But we got tremendous response to that. I'll read a few comments that viewers left from that one. And there were a lot like this. This one is a recent comment. I really enjoyed this discussion. It was refreshing to hear things described in an academic fashion rather than the usual blame game and moaning on so many other podcasts. Nice to see someone debunk patriarchy too. And he put patriarchy in quotes. And then, and there were other ones that were really, really positive too. Dr. Dani Sulikowski is just beyond amazing. What a beautiful interview. Excellent talk. And then you get this current of really harsh comments. Like I titled the episode, How Women Contribute to Societal Collapse. And so here's a viewer who says, contribute. That's cute. I think the word you were looking for is cause. And then another sort of...
It's all us. It's all on us.
Another very common one is, you're years late into just realizing all this. We've known the problem for decades. So that's another one where... and then some more serious ones that are not snarky, but worth talking about. Divorce and family courts in Western countries make it financial suicide for any man to get involved with a woman. And if they have children together, even worse. It just doesn't make sense. And that's another sentiment that I see expressed quite a bit. This one was nice. I was suspicious my algorithm was trying to make me hate women and think they are evil and unintelligent. And I'm so glad that this is not the case by this example of women demonstrating intelligence and goodwill. So that was a good one.
That's lovely.
And then a ton of them that say rescind the 19th Amendment. So basically take the voting right away from...
That's where all the trouble started.
And so we had Christine Siefenwolk with us in the last dialogue that we did, and she wasn't able to be here this week. So I thought I would see if I could rope Dean in. And so Dr. Dean Abbott, we spoke with you just a couple of weeks ago on this live stream, and it was a wonderful conversation. And I really appreciate the nuance with which you approach this kind of war of the sexes that we see going on online. I really like your thinking around a lot of these issues that we see, and the way that you address the angst in men and in women when we're engaging in these, theoretical discussions. So I'm delighted to have you back with us as well.
Believe it or not, there are many who do not appreciate nuance in this discussion.
Oh, I believe
it. I think they want a clear villain.
Yeah. And they're all on my YouTube channel. Apparently.
They're very industrious, if nothing else.
We have a lot of wonderful viewers, but I thought I'd open up. Dani, I have a question for you from one of our members on locals. And I thought I would start out with that one, if you don't mind. Let me just open it up here. And he says, first, not exactly questions, but a couple of ideas that I picked up from an interview you did on a different podcast. And I don't remember these coming up in your previous Solid Ground appearance, so I figured it would be helpful to highlight them for this one. Would love to hear you speak about them or to them and correct any misapprehensions I may have. First, my understanding is that in Evo-Psych theory, the evolutionary reason for a behavior doesn't need to be conscious for the behavior to be selected for and expressed. So the question of why women believe themselves to be doing things is tangential to the truth of whether or not evolution has primed them to do those things, so other women have fewer offspring. And not to flood the zone here, but I'll just, I'll read his entire thing, and if we need to go back, we will. Second, according to your thesis, as I understand it, this behavior is specifically female because of the difference in reproductive capacity between women and men. Since men can physically be so much more reproductively prolific, if a man drops out of the gene pool, his missing potential offspring can easily be replaced by any number of the other local men. So a sabotage-oriented man would have to take out quite a number of his fellows to make a difference in terms of his own offspring's proportion to the next generation. And that same male capacity for prolific breeding also makes flooding the zone, that's funny that I just used that same phrase, maybe I got it from him, as it were, just the better strategy. The flip side of that logic makes sabotage the better strategy for women. And an actual question, what's the state of your research on this thesis? Is there anything you think could falsify it, such as if a certain kind of data is discovered or a question is answered in an irreconcilable way? So that's a big one, but I'm curious for your thoughts.
Okay, so yeah, we'll start with the first one, I suppose. So essentially, yes, that's correct, that whether or not women or indeed anyone is conscious of the underlying ultimate motives for their behavior is almost irrelevant to understanding the behavior itself. So it's consciousness is best thought of. Well, I mean, that's a huge question as to what consciousness is and why it exists and how it functions. But with respect to people's beliefs about why they're behaving the way that they behave, it's best thought of as part of the mechanisms that produce that behavior. So one of the things I've pointed out before is that in order for intrasexual competitiveness to rise to really high levels, that requires sort of ostensibly a large amount of people in the case of female intrasexual competition women, a large proportion of women to engage in behaviors that are ostensibly harmful to other women. So harmful to their reproductive success, that's the currency that evolution cares about. But we also know increasingly now that it causes proximate harm as well. So it's becoming more and more clear as women end up sort of leaving their fertile years and realizing that they haven't had children at all, that's having, really detrimental effects on women's health and well-being. And I was talking to someone not too long ago about the rise of female support groups that are starting to spring up for these post-reproductive childless women who are just beginning to realize that they have in fact left it too late and there is no more maybe. So this requires women to engage in a lot of harm. Now, in order for people to be able to engage in ways that cause harm, there needs to be some sort of mitigation of the fact that people don't like doing that. People are generally quite pro-social. We're a very pro-social species. We live in, and I don't necessarily mean doing things that are good for each other, but we are just a very social species. We live in large, complex societies. We rely on each other and our different specialized roles in those societies. And so, generally it would make sense that humans would be selected to, not be very highly motivated to harm others. And that's largely what we see, with sort of the exception of the small number of people who develop a social parasitic strategy. So in order for intrasexually competitive behaviours that are harmful to manifest at really quite high levels, high enough that they're going to sort of result in social-wide or society-wide birth rate decline and birth rate suppression, there needs to be some conscious understanding of that behaviour that doesn't frame it as harmful or nasty. And so in some senses, when you're only interested in the functional implications of a behaviour, then you're only interested in what its outcomes are. You don't really care why people do what they do, or why people think they do what they do. You just care what the outcomes are, and the outcomes tell you what the function of the behaviour is. But if you're interested in the mechanisms by which that behaviour occurs, how is it that individual people are actually able to do these things, then the conscious beliefs around why people are doing them become relevant, because it becomes relevant for people to be able to tell a story to themselves about why what it is they're doing is actually ostensibly a good thing rather than ostensibly a bad thing. So that's sort of how the consciousness as the place of conscious awareness of these behaviours. That's where it sits in this explanation. It's relevant to understanding the mechanisms by which individual people sort of rationalise their own behaviour, and indeed how they can then use those rationalisations to manipulate and leverage other people to engage in similar types of behaviours as well, of course. So arguments in favour of certain aspects of feminism, in order to promote those narratives, obviously frame it as a very pro-female, pro-women ideology, when the outcomes of it are anything but in most cases. So that's kind of where consciousness sits. The second question was about, can you remind me?
Yes, sure.
Bit?
His second bit is about the difference in reproductive capacity between women and men, and the subsequent different sort of suppressive strategies that they might adopt.
Yeah. So again, what the question or what it was sort of summarizing is, again, essentially correct. So people would be most familiar with this concept in that most people understand that the reproductive capacity of a society is held within its women. This is why societies can afford to send large number of men to war. Effectively, from a reproductive standpoint, it sounds quite cold to say that they're simply being removed from the gene pool. But from a reproductive standpoint, the impact of that is that those young men are removed from the gene pool. And a society can recover its population much more quickly if it sends men off to war than if it sends an equivalent amount of women off to war to die. And so for exactly the same reason, an individual man attempting a strategy of reproductive suppression of rivals is going to have to suppress the reproduction of a lot more rivals to move the dial on the background reproductive rate, if in fact he can do it at all. And so that means that from the perspective of a society where there is a fixed reproductive capacity fixed by the number of women, in order for reproductive suppression to kind of be selected for generation to generation and really begin to dial up, it's got to come from the women. And the reason why you get women attacking women's reproductive success and men attacking men's reproductive success also comes back to sort of the basic evolutionary mechanisms of intrasexual competition. Every offspring is fathered by one male and one female. Therefore, the male and female share of reproductive capacity in any population is identical. So men can only improve their own reproductive capacity by attacking the reproductive capacity of other men. Women can only gain by attacking the reproductive capacity of other women. So the majority of attempts to manipulate reproductive outcomes involve individuals, promoting themselves and manipulating the behavior of same-sex rivals. You don't tend to get that cross-sex manipulation near so much. However, I will caveat that by saying that one of the things I've also spoken about is the really interesting observation that whilst I'm framing much of what I'm saying from the perspective of female reproductive suppression, it's very interesting to observe what can sort of be described as male, so maybe cooperation even to some extent, but at least permissiveness. So if we imagine an alternative theory to the one I'm proposing, imagine a theory that suggests that what we're observing now is not adaptive female reproductive suppression. It's not kind of, human women operating as intended or as selected. It's actually some sort of an aberration, where we're seeing just, female reproductive suppression going off on some sort of a runaway that's, having detrimental effects on society, but this is not how it's meant to happen. This is something going wrong. You would expect that, given that there is the propensity for female reproductive suppression to run away, that men would have been under tremendous selection pressure, if indeed it was in their favour to do so, to respond to really high levels of female intrasexual competition by policing the kinds of things that highly competitive women try to do. Except we're not seeing that. If anything, we're seeing a male acquiescence to these types of feminist ideologies and the types of reproductively suppressive ideologies. And that's one of the observations that supports the idea that this is actually human society functioning as intended. When societies become, sort of, to steal Helen Andrews' language, kind of highly feminized, and we get these highly feminized institutions, and you see reproductive suppression beginning to happen at like a sort of, top-down kind of way. It's no longer just happening sideways, like peer to peer, like we're now seeing it. These, society being flooded with these top-down messages coming from the elites and coming from our institutions and our leaders.
Can you give an example of some of those messages?
Oh, bazillions of them. Don't have children because it's going to destroy the planet. You're going to boil the earth. Healthy relationships where partners support each other is an example of man keeping. Women are tired of having to do unpaid emotional labour, unpaid childcare, unpaid household labour. Don't have a child early. It will destroy your life. Prioritise your career. Girl boss women can have it all. All of these top-down narrative, end the pay gap. The only way that you can end the pay gap is if both sexes invest equally in both reproduction and the workplace. Now, women inevitably, biologically, must invest more in reproduction than men if reproduction is going to happen. The only way you eradicate the gender pay gap is if you eradicate parenthood. It's the only way, right? So all of these top-down messages are all reproductively suppressing, and they're all either, really quite mainstream institutional messages from feminism, which the West has adopted. Perhaps not its more extreme versions in full, but certainly mainstream feminism has been adopted as a largely accepted good thing. Good principles by which to organise society, like not necessarily its more extreme versions, but the middle of the road stuff. And more recently, we're seeing some of the more extreme ideologies and more extreme ideas becoming more mainstream, like the antinatalism associated with the climate change and climate crisis and net zero and things like that. So a lot of these, a lot of these messages are coming down from on high. And of course, they're not only coming down from on high, they're being proliferated and supported peer to peer and within the society as well. Many of them have widespread support, possibly even you could say consensus support, that these are generally good things. And so the fact that men effectively are cooperating in what I would call the dismantling, tearing down, packing up and going home of society suggests that this is this is human society functioning as intended. It may be driven by female intersexual competition and female reproductive suppression, but I'm not seeing a lot of evidence that men as a group have been under any selection pressure to mobilise in response to signals that the society that they build is being dismantled, to respond in any kind of a way that seeks to protect that society. So that also suggests that men are in fact playing their role in the outcomes, and their behaviour on the whole as a group is in fact contributing to these outcomes rather than resisting those outcomes. That is also a relevant thing to point out. It's not because, again, if women are doing this because it's ultimately advantageous reproductively speaking, genetically, well, those female lineages that will ultimately survive and benefit and go on to become some sort of a founder population, of course, all of those female lineages are male lineages as well, right? So men are also going to be playing the game of trying to make sure that if indeed we're at a point where society is going to pack up and go home, then the few lineages that are left are going to win massively genetically, and men are playing the game of musical chairs to make sure their lineages is one of the ones left at the end, or rather to make sure that the end comes whilst their lineage is represented and strong. Men are going to be playing that game of musical chairs as much as women. It's just that my theory postulates that one of the key processes in how this goes is a female-driven process of reproductive suppression.
You know, when you're speaking about female, and to the question from the member, female versus male reproductive suppressive tactics, it would seem to me that war is a very directly male reproductive suppressive tactic, because you're killing vast numbers of the other, but it's directed outward from one's own in-group. So there's an outward direction of that, and it takes that direct, violent character. But what you're describing with women is more of an inwardly directed in towards the group suppression within. And so I don't know if that's relevant, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think when it comes to war, and there's I'm sure there's people who've thought much more about this than I have, and so could probably offer more informed comments. But when it comes to war, I think in terms of the selection pressures on that, we're kind of looking at selection at the level of, the level of the group or the society or the nation state, however you want to define the warring groups. So that's a kind of group versus group level of selection. So if you're in a group that defends its territories and its resources, and indeed sometimes even not just defends itself, but actually instigates war in order to get more territory and more resources, versus a group who refuses to do that, well, if the group who refuses to do that is not going to leave many descendants in the overall population. So the existence of groups willing to do that, places very, very strong selection pressure on other groups to do the same. So I'm not sure that you need to invoke male intrasexual competition, even though it obviously has implications for male intrasexual competition. I don't think you need to invoke male intrasexual competition to understand the dynamics of war. Doesn't mean it doesn't have any, but I'm not sure that it's the primary story to tell.
Well, and I guess the reason I would go there is one of the main questions that I had for you, or the places where I had some, I guess, skepticism around the theory, is that I don't necessarily see women as acting in a long-term suppressive way towards other women. I see it more in terms of short-term. So I'm not sure how to get on board or how to wrap my mind around the idea that women would engage in reproductive suppression of others, thinking that my genes will win out in the end long after I'm gone. That part of the rationale evades me a little bit. I can see a lot of reasoning behind some of the shorter term stuff that you're talking about, and it makes sense to me. That piece doesn't quite make sense to me. But if I do get on board with that, then I would see war as being directly a corollary of that, because we're going to wipe out the other. We're not necessarily thinking that that's what we're doing is wiping their genes from the planet so that ours might proliferate. But by a similar logic to this short-term reproductive suppressive strategies, ending up with the woman's genes being there at the end, so in war, would that end up being the consequence of that behavior? If I'm articulating that okay.
Yeah, that's right. So it comes, and again, it comes back a little bit to the consciousness argument and the proximate ultimate distinction. If women are engaging in sort of manipulative reproductive suppression on a short-term scale, and they keep doing that, that's going to have long-term consequences. It's unavoidable. They don't have to understand the long-term consequences or be aware of them or even be in favor of them. In fact, they could be consciously, vehemently opposed to them. But if they are the long-term consequences of the behavior and they engage in the behavior, then the consequences are going to happen, if you know what I mean. So I saw some really interesting, and again, I really need to get better at remembering people's names so that I can give them their due credit. Maybe I can try and look this guy up and give you his name later, and you can pop it up for people or something. But I saw some really interesting demography work looking at birth rate decline, and what he was showing, or the statistics he was discussing, effectively demonstrated that once women get past their early 30s, the odds, if they don't have a child by then, the odds of them ever having a child is less than a quarter. So less than 25% of women. I forget the exact age. Maybe it might have been, I feel like it might have been 34, something like that. Once you get past that, if you haven't yet had a child, the odds of you having one drops substantially. So, and at the same time, if you can, once the mean age at which women have their first children reaches that early 30s in a society, that's enough to sort of bring about some sort of a tipping point where the overall birth rate really then starts to drop substantially. And if you think about the dominant feminist narratives that we have now, and again, they're not even thought of necessarily as especially feminist, I think, which is how mainstream they've become. But the idea that women who would get married and have children in their 20s are like, oh, are you sure you're ready? That's quite early. And yet just leaving it until the early 30s is enough to drastically reduce the chances of it ever happening, and to drastically reduce the rate at which it happens across a society. So we don't need, in order to implement really successful reproductive suppression, you do not need to convince women to not have babies up until they're 45 and menopause, starts to really hit home. You only need to convince them to delay until their very early 30s, which for in many cases has been achieved. If you ask most young girls young women, older girls, younger women, late teens, very early 20s, when they think it would be a good time to start a family, early 30s is a very common answer. And that's a terrible answer. That's an awful answer. But that's a very common answer. That's become something of a norm. Don't get married in your 20s. Don't have children. Get your career established first. Get yourself sorted. You've got plenty of time. You can wait. Well, actually, demographically, you don't have plenty of time. You leave it to your 30s, and you're in a massive pickle that you're not very likely to get out of. And again, if you're thinking about manipulative reproductive suppression from an evolutionary perspective, if we're now talking about women not targeting individual rivals, as in I need this particular rival to not reproduce because, for say, I want her to break up and I want her partner, that's more the male style of sort of attacking rivals. Male intrasexual competition primarily focuses on the self. I'm going to win by winning. I don't care what other men are doing. I'm just going to do it better than they are. But I'm not actually going to try and interfere with what they're doing. For men, it's more like a running race, right? If you run as fastest, you win. You don't have to necessarily interfere with what your competitors are doing. And that's much more the male pattern, right? The female pattern is basically running as fast as you can while sticking every limb out sideways so your competitors trip over. And that strategy doesn't rely on any individual competitor tripping over and ultimately falling out of the race. As long as some proportion of them do, it's an effective strategy. So it can be like a scattergun strategy and be very effective, which means that in order to judge its effectiveness, we don't need to think about, well, is it effective in every individual instance where women do it? But is there enough effectiveness if enough women take this scattergun approach that it can have an impact? And the answer, we can see the answer. The answer is yes. Absolutely, the answer is yes. So that's kind of, I do forget what the point of this initial discussion was. Have I answered a question in that?
I think so. Yeah. And I wanted to check in with Dean and invite you have any reflections or thoughts or questions?
I have a few questions. In the first interview that I saw, you mentioned that it sounded like when you talked about intrasexual competitiveness among women, that you measured that kind of on a scale, that some women are higher than others. And did I get that right? What do
Yeah.
you what do you think causes that variance?
So I think so a couple of things. Yes, you're right. There is a scale that measures that. That scale is somewhat narrow. So what it actually measures really is a sort of very proximate competitive feeling towards other women. So that scale becomes sort of less and less relevant at predicting the types of sort of competitive behaviors that we see that are couched in positive terms. So, if we're sort of hypothesizing, as I am, that feminism is largely a vehicle of reproductive suppression, many women are not, feminists because they're anti-women or anti-motherhood or anti-natal. They're feminists very much because they think they're pro-women, and very much because they believe that that these feminist narratives and feminist ideas are ultimately going to lead to much better lives for women. And so you wouldn't expect many of what I'm sort of suggesting constitutes this reproductive suppression to actually be predicted very well by scores on that intersexual competitiveness scale, because that scale very much targets, competitive sort of envy, feelings of rivalry with other women. But yes, that scale exists. And I think that individual differences in, what that particular scale measures, but just in all of these types of tendencies generally, are accounted for by much the same thing that accounts for individual differences in personality generally. So what you have is in terms of the social environment that people live in, that's quite a heterogeneous environment. And we see some people being extrovert, some people being introvert, some people being sort of more long-term goal focused and very conscientious, and other people being very spontaneous or impulsive, if you like. And all of these are sort of different ways of attempting to find some sort of local optimum. So, on a rather grand scale, the dark triad of traits are probably adaptive because they exploit others, right? So the rest of humanity, which is largely altruistic, largely cooperative, largely sort of mutualistic and fair-minded, and tend to make, whether we realize it or not, we tend to make the assumption about most people that we meet that other people are like that too, until we get clear evidence to the contrary. And so individuals that are very exploitative can exploit that assumption, and therefore the rest of us become, rather than individuals with whom we can cooperate with, which means we both put in something and we both try to get out more than we put in, because what we put in builds something, right? And we both try to get out more, we both benefit from that arrangement. Of course, individuals who are exploitative try to put in much less than what others put in and try to get out much more than what others get out. But that strategy is only adaptive at really, really low frequencies, which is why very few people are actually that exploitative, because for a start, that strategy only works if most everyone around you is going to assume that you are nice and cooperative and basically allow themselves to be exploited. So if there are too many of those individuals around, not only do they keep encountering each other, and therefore their strategies don't work, but also if those individuals rise to any kind of sort of higher frequency, everyone else around them begins to be placed under selection pressure to no longer assume that everybody is nice, and to start policing for that type of behavior and punishing those individuals quite heavily. And so what you actually see is some sort of a balance across societies where it's beneficial to be like that as long as you stay at low frequencies. Once people like that, and because it's beneficial, you would expect the frequency to rise, but then of course it gets too high, it becomes maladaptive in the frequency. So we see it as some sort of a balance over the long term. You can think of the rest of personality traits as being in a similar type of balance. That, if there are too many individuals that are too high in those traits, the benefits of being high in those traits becomes less because of the balance of the people around you and the way those traits fit in. So this is sort of not by a long way not my theory of personality. There's various other people that have spoken about why we have such individual differences in personality traits. And I'm probably there are nuances within there that people discuss, but that's kind of like the basic idea of one of the big ideas of why individual differences in personality exist. And so depending on, in terms of intrasexual competitiveness, a lot of things about you would make it beneficial for you to be highly competitive, whereas there might be other traits that would make it less beneficial for you to be competitive. So if you're really high on mate value, it might not be very beneficial for you to be very intrasexually competitive, for example. So intrasexual competition bears a lot of costs. If you spend your time as a woman, let's just stick with that example, if you spend your time being socially aggressive to other women, spreading gossip, being manipulative, you'll get away with it for a while, and it might bring you a lot of benefits, but it also obviously is a risky strategy. You may not get away with it for very long. People may not like you. People may ostracize you. So if you're of really high mate value, have access to excellent resources, you may not need to care very much what other women are doing. You can win. Regardless of that, you can win the reproductive game. You could accrue the resources, get the husband, have the fantastic genes, have the large family, be able to raise it. And you don't need to get down and dirty in the mud, for example. And yet there would be other circumstances that individuals could be in where the sort of expected marginal payoff of those types of behaviours would be much greater. So how competitive any individual woman is, I think, depends on what the sort of, expected returns are. And by expected returns, I don't mean consciously, but you can sort of imagine, along your developmental trajectory, you get feedback from other people about your mate value, about your mate quality, about how in demand you are. You obviously get feedback about the level of resources you have, where in society stratification you sit, and you get information about the individuals around you, because of course social norms play a huge part in the behaviour that anyone can get away with. If intersexually competitive behaviours are quite normalised, then you're going to bear a much lower social cost for engaging in them yourself. So, there's a huge number of variables that go into dictating those levels of, if you want to call it a personality trait.
Just as you mentioned the dark triad traits being beneficial at a low frequency, etc. Is there anything like a predictable personality structure that correlates with, say, low or high intersexual competitiveness?
Indeed, and it's the dark traits. So a paper I'm working on with a great friend and great collaborator of mine, PK Jonason, we've actually looked at intersexual competitiveness as one of the reasons why, as one of the pathways through which individuals high on the dark traits have greater reproductive success. So there's some evidence, in spite of these, that sort of paradoxically, because individuals high on the dark traits are, they're not nice people, right? Like, they're not nice in a bunch of different ways, but they're not nice people. And the most in-demand characteristic in a long-term partner for both men and women is kindness. So kindness trumps looks for men choosing women, and kindness trumps resources for women choosing men. So even though we know that men value looks highly, women value resources highly, kindness actually trumps both for both sexes. So it's the single most sought after trait. And of course, individuals high on the dark triad profoundly lack it in any way, shape or form. And yet, quite paradoxically, there is some evidence that, at least in some circumstances, they actually are viewed as sort of sought after mates, and not just physically, although that is part of it. So individuals high on the dark triad do appear to be especially good and put a lot of effort into grooming. There is a return on that. But it's not just in physical appearance. So if you present dark traits without people being able to see what the person looks like, so you present like a description of people's personality, or you sort of allow people to interact in a way where they can't actually see what each other look like, so you can pull physical appearance out of it, then you still see, again, in some circumstances, some evidence that dark traits actually make people more attractive as prospective mates, but it's a very weak effect. So what we looked at, one of the things we looked at is whether or not individuals high on the dark triad might tetrad, we included sadism, might actually have the key to their better reproductive success actually because they're better at intrasexual competition. And the broad answer actually was yes. So all 4 of the dark traits pretty strongly predict intrasexual competitiveness, so just self-reported intrasexual competitiveness. But even more than that, they also predict a bunch of different tactics of intrasexual competition. So the higher you are on the dark traits, the more likely you are to engage in competitor derogation, to engage in competitor manipulation. So competitor derogation is sort of attempting to put your competitors down, either to their face, to sort of manipulate their own perceptions of their own mate value. So people's perceptions of their own mate value determines where they market themselves on the mating market. If you can make someone think they are less desirable than they are, they will market themselves lower and effectively take them out of your strata. Women are particularly good at that one, but men do it too. So competitor derogation. Then there's competitor manipulation, which is actually convincing a competitor to do things that is in your interest rather than theirs. And self-promotion is also a big one. And what was interesting about that study, so all of those actually contributed. So individuals high on the dark tetrad, pretty much across all 4 of the dark traits, psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sadism, all engaged in all more intersexually competitively motivated and engaged in all of those tactics of intersexual competition to a greater extent. They also engaged in a greater extent to mate manipulation, which is when it's almost like a 2-level strategy. So you don't manipulate your rivals in order to get them to make decisions that are bad for them. By mate manipulation, we don't mean your mates, we mean your rivals' mates. So actually manipulating your rivals' mates to make them make decisions that are bad for your rivals. And individuals high on the dark triad are also more likely to do that, but it didn't contribute to their overall mate value. So we think that that's probably because of the way it works, is probably something they do that incurs a little bit of a cost to their own mate value, but because it impacts the mate value of rivals more than it impacts their own mate value, it still becomes a net adaptive behavior, because reproductive success is relative, and it's really important to remember that it's not absolute. What matters is that you reproduce more than other people, not how much you reproduce.
Meg, I have one more question.
Yes, please.
This is a more of a perhaps a speculative or philosophical question, but in the theory that you've put forward, it seems to me that there's an anthropology there that is more or less materialistic, and it's materialistic in the sense that the underlying central point of all human life is reproduction, and but human beings aren't simply concerned with reproduction, especially when it comes to things like love and family. We have lots of moral, religious, spiritual, idealistic impulses around that as well. And my question for you is, where does all of that fit in? Because it seems to me that that as you've spoken, maybe those things are all kind of epiphenomenon that we use to justify our intersexual competition or our own level of dark triadism. But if that's true, then and there's nothing to care about except reproduction, why would men, for example, step in to interfere at the end of a civilization when what actually motivates a lot of men's behavior are things like ideals, that there are many men who will die for their country regardless of whether they have reproduced? And so, what is the role of motivating factors outside of the drive to reproduce in your understanding of all of this behavior?
So the central role of reproductive output, it's not so much that, however you put it, I think sort of you said it's the basis of human life. It's not so much the basis of human life as it's the basis of life. So the currency of evolution is reproductive success. That's, That's it. You can't get around it. And, certainly there are people who, philosophize about humans having sort of transcended that and having greater purpose. And I don't, I don't sort of find any of those philosophies especially appealing. Primarily because I don't think that we need them. So what you were saying about all of these other things all being epiphenomena, they are, but they're not just in service of intersexual competition, but they are ultimately in service of reproductive success. And that, again, so reproductive success is critical at the level of individuals within a society, but there's also what we sort of call multi-level selection. So that is that you've got, societies competing with each other. So, a society that very successfully goes out and fights wars and destroys other groups is going to continue. A society that sort of does nothing when doesn't respond and doesn't try to defend itself when somebody comes and attacks it is not going to sustain. And so those ones are going to disappear very quickly. And so that sort of means that, the humans that we have now are humans who are descended from tribes, groups, societies, nation states that attempted to defend themselves. And all of the other epiphenomena are all in the same service, ultimately, of reproduction, not just in intersexual competition, but in reproduction. So the building of spiritualism and philosophies and things around the importance of family is all in the service of reproductive success. There's a few really effective ways that you can sort of break down a society and bring it into chaos, but destroying the family unit is one of those. So as soon as you have high levels of single motherhood and fatherlessness, we see high levels of crime. We see much poorer outcomes generally, across the board in terms of education, employment, going on to have your own families and things like that. So, so one of the arguments that I mount is that the attack on the traditional family is itself a form of reproductive suppression, because it is a very effective way to suppress reproduction, to discourage people from having children in traditional family environments. It produces less children, and it produces the children it does produce outside of traditional family environments have far worse outcomes than children produced inside those. And so all of these epiphenomena, they're all in service, and that includes things like men having these very strong ideals. One of the best things I think I saw, and I just love it, is I've got to try and make sure I get this right. It was just like a little cartoon meme, and it was like, time machine, time travel gets invented or something, like time travel gets invented, and it's got women, and it's got this sort of a younger girl and a sort of a older than her but still sort of a young woman, and it's like and it just sort of so, oh, who are you? And it's like, I'm you from the future. And then something really trite, like, I can teach you how to do, I forget what it was, but something really trite and nothing, right? And obviously didn't make much impact on me, right? And that was the women one. And then it had men, and it's like this sort of nerdy 16, like, it's 15, 16-year-old boy, and there's like a, sort of looks like a Roman centurion sort of comes up, and it says, who are you? And he says, I'm, someone, and it was I think it was a Roman name, or maybe he just said, I'm from the future, or I'm from the past or something. And he said, oh, we're going to the fall of Constantinople. And I thought that just perfectly captures the difference between men and women, or one difference between men and women in those ideologies and those idealized ideas. If we invented something like time travel, women would want to know the future in order to improve their own immediate self-benefits. Men would want to go and save the fall of Rome.
That's so interesting. So interesting. And it kind of comes back to a question that I have about the long-term or short-term thinking in these reproductive suppressive strategies, because inherently I'm in agreement with what you're pointing out there, and I think that short-term thinking would make it difficult for a lot of women to be thinking in this really broad, reproductively suppressing manner. So I wonder, and while I do think that there's a lot of like mate poaching and attractiveness, competitiveness, I absolutely agree with that. I guess I'm wondering about that scale and what you think of that. And I had another question that just completely skipped my mind as I was talking. So I apologize for that. Maybe it's my short-term thinking. I just can't hold on to.
We'll see how we go. But I think what you're kind of hitting on there, I think is actually it's not a bug, it's a feature, right? If women had more long-term thinking and were focused on the long-term consequences of these types of things, that would make it harder for most women to engage in these types of behaviors. It's because women are focused on the short-term, immediate gains that they get from these behaviors, that's what allows them to manifest. So it's not so much that women at this point in time are thinking about, what's going to be happening in 50 or 100 years if, if you think sort of in the most stark, bleak kind of way, and like all the women now just decided that I'm going to go child free, that's it, we're just not going to have any more baby. I mean, the sort of medium term economic consequences of that would be horrific, followed not very long after by some very, very final, horrible consequences for society itself. And if that happened on a worldwide scale, then we're talking about humanity itself. But that's not what anybody is thinking about, or at least not unless they're turning their mind directly to it, as some demographers getting increasingly concerned about birth rate decline are beginning to turn their mind to it. But in terms of the sort of, the average regular woman who is sort of engaging in these reproductively suppressing behaviors, that's not what they're thinking about. What they're thinking about is, I want to be financially secure. I think it's great for other women to want to be financially secure. I think that's a good thing. Therefore, I think it's a good thing for women to put motherhood and families on hold and deal with their own careers and get themselves independent. And I think that's a good thing. And, there's plenty of time later to get married and have children. And if that doesn't happen, that's okay for any individual woman, because they can still be happy with their own independent life. You don't need a man to be happy. That's fine. And it's, it's much more important to be single but independent and wealthy and secure than it is to be married but to be, miserable and stuck looking after children and never to have had a career and never to have traveled. So, women are very, and men as well, are very easily able to, generate narratives that are very reproductively suppressing without having to ever consider that the main point of the narrative is reproductively suppressing. I mean, the majority of women, I think, I don't know, we'd probably have to do some surveys, but the impression I get is that so far, at least, the majority of people still are not heavily antenatal. But what we are seeing is the center of gravity of value that is placed on having children is declining. And that means that whilst people might not be explicitly antenatal, they're much more ready to tolerate childlessness as an outcome in favor of, other outcomes. Yes, I might end up childless, but at least I'll be wealthy, right? Whereas, that would not be considered a healthy popular consensus if we go back 20, 30, 50 years, however far back we might need to go, where the family was really at the center, going back to Dean's sort of point about the ideals and the idealisms and the men who would sacrifice themselves for the nation and that kind of pride and honor. Those are the values that we associate with a society that is flourishing and growing. And, I don't want to say I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, so I'll try and say it quite carefully. In a flourishing society, men play incredibly important roles, and some of those very important roles require men to effectively be sacrificial for the good of the rest of society. And it's not a kind of group selection hypothesis where the individuals are sacrificing themselves for the good of the group. It's more like a kin selection hypothesis. So women were primarily the ones through which obviously men contributed to reproductive success as well, but even men who didn't had sisters or had brothers who had children, some of which were daughters. And so societies looked after their women a lot because, again, they're the reproductive capacity rate limiters. So in terms of physical safety, society looked after women. It sent men down the mines, right? It looked after women. It sent men to war. It looked after women. It worked men to the bone. And the payoff that men got for that, the genetic payoff men got for that, is that the reproductive rates were high and men were rewarded they were rewarded handsomely with wealth for taking those risks. And if they survived those risks, then that wealth allowed them to do very well in terms of the mating market and the marriage and the having lots of children. And so men were handsomely rewarded if they survived those risks. And even if they didn't, they were revered, right? So, men were considered heroes simply for being men, and that's a perfectly appropriate way for society to treat the sex that bears a lot of the brunt of society's negative outcomes and works very hard, and frequently its individuals give up their life without even reproducing in extreme circumstances. What we've seen now, part of the narrative shift away from those traditional norms, and we see it at its sort of most extreme end with this sort of notions of toxic masculinity that keep getting bandied about everywhere. But not only have men been stripped of the sort of inherent heroism of being a man, they've actually been demonized in the inherent heroism of being a man, of physically working hard, of putting yourself in danger, of being the man in the social situation, the person in the social situation who is expected to put himself in danger if in order to protect a woman or a child. If there's something violent happening, or if there's an accident, that the man is expected to be the one who goes in the river to rescue the drowning woman or child. And the social reward of those expectations was revere and heroism. Now that has been completely replaced, where masculinity it's hard to even find the word masculinity being quoted anywhere without toxic being put in front of it. And so now the inherent value of men has been demonized and devalued and disregarded. And so men are being heavily sort of influenced by feminist narratives not to engage in those types of behaviors. And that's sort of on a grand scale. And of course you can see it very clearly on a very small axe scale, where men will be accused of being sexist if they open a door for women. So sort of basic gendered acts of gendered politeness, the sort of the basic etiquettes that civil society had in place, they're of course being broken down and being actively broken down as well. So leaving sort of men and many women not really knowing how to behave, and most importantly not having a shared understanding of how each should behave, because that's of course what etiquettes are for. They're not about one person having power or any of that feminist nonsense. Etiquettes is about setting a ground rules so that individuals who don't know each other well have a shared understanding of how it's appropriate to behave, and a shared understanding of how they can safely indicate green lights and red lights for further continuation of the relationship. Right, that's what etiquette's about, and of course that's been completely broken down, which just makes mate choice and mate acquisition that much harder to navigate for everybody. Again, I feel like I've gone off the point, but I hope I answered the question.
Oh, I think that's fantastic, and I think you're making a really good point about etiquette. If we had more time and we were going into a second hour, what I'd really like to bring up, and I'll just like float it and drop it since we don't have that much time, but is the consequences of the sexual revolution, of the pill, of, something you brought up last time about dating apps is that a lot of men are, even if they really do desire a longer term relationship, they also are often interested in a short term mating strategy, which involves reducing the cost of the investment in short term sex. And so
Yeah.
what we see post that point in our modern history is that we've had just a gradual and now all at once sort of degradation of those etiquettes and of the cost of sexual behavior for men and women, to the point where I think that we're at this point right now that almost epitomizes that that cascade with the rampant use of pornography and the engagement in pornography production on both sides of that spectrum. So if we had more time, that's a thing I'd like to hear, your thoughts on. But just because we're wrapping up, I wanted to really quickly invite Jennifer and Dean, if you have any reflections or final thoughts or things that you want to float for people to consider, or that you would ask, and we could maybe go off of in a future conversation.
I was wondering about how the struggle for reproductive rights is involved or not involved in reproductive suppression. So maybe that could be a topic for another day.
Okay, that's great. Great.
I
Yeah,
think I
Dean.
I think I would want to pursue the philosophical assumptions here a little more, like I was bringing up. And really the question of the epiphenomenon um and and the question of are epiphenomenon, what's the nature of their reality? So is it the case that um say our love for our spouse and children is just a justification for our reproduction? So like is my love for my daughters just an epiphenomenon of my sort of programming, my animalistic programming, or is there something real about my love for my daughters that exists independently of my animal bodily drives? And I know we obviously don't have time to do that, but that's the kind of question that comes to me that I'm interested in.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I find that very interesting too. And then there's the question from our locals member that he finished up with, which was asking about if there's anything that Dani thinks that could falsify your thesis, if it's answer or a question that could be answered in an irreconcilable way. So all of those are giant, chewy subjects that that if only we had all day, we could get into. But thank you all for this wonderful discussion. Dani, it's a pleasure to see you again and to hear more of your thoughts on this. Dean, it is a pleasure to see you again and hear your thoughts and reflections and questions. I think they really enrich the subject quite a bit. There's so many directions to go from this, and we know from what we see on the statistics of human reproduction right now and what we read online, that there's a lot of relationship pessimism, and there's something really wrong right now in terms of, thriving, happy family support and production. So men and women have a lot of suspicion, a lot of distrust. And I think that these conversations are really good to have right now in a sober and curious way that doesn't look, like somebody said, to assign blame, but rather looks to understand what's going on. So I think that this is fantastic. And I'm so glad that you all joined us for this discussion. And thank you to everybody in the chat. If you guys have a chance to go back and revisit the live chat, it was really hopping today with lots and lots of questions and thoughts from people, really, really intelligent people in the chat. So sorry we didn't get a chance to read your chats out loud today. It's just such a packed topic. So thank you all so much. And we will be here next Monday. So we'll look forward to seeing y'all then. And I hope everybody has a wonderful week and a happy Thanksgiving